On Sunday I went to church. Just thought I'd let you know. But that's the way we refer to what for most of us is a weekly event in our routine of life. I went to church. There are not many people who would find that report of my weekend activities particularly thrilling. Indeed, I'm not at all sure that many of us here who engage in this regular habit find it breathtaking. But we are wrong. All over the world there are groups of Christian believers whose importance and significance is utterly stunning. I've begun reading a new book from Christopher Ash. Many of you will know Christopher as the author of that excellent book on marriage, Sex in the Service of God. I was reading it recently on a plane. It was one of those books that I really didn't want the person next to me to notice. And asked me what I was... I mean, that's how gutless I am, isn't it? It really ought to lead to a good conversation, shouldn't it? But anyway, this is his latest one. And it's a survey of the Bible with an important thesis. Let me just read you a little bit from the opening pages. Christopher writes, "The thesis of this little book is that the ordinary local Christian church contains within itself the seeds or the DNA of a remade world. That will seem a very surprising thesis to those who think the local church is a complete irrelevance to the real world, and it will be greeted with ironic smiles by those whose experience of local churches is one of strife and tension, but I believe it to be true. I want to persuade us to commit ourselves wholeheartedly to belonging to and serving God in the fellowship of a local church, and that this may prove to be the most significant thing we do with our lives. I want to convince us that the local church is at the heart of the Bible story, that it is close to the heart of the purposes of God, that it is how a broken world will be remade. I want to share my passion that the glory of God is inseparably tied up with what happens in the local church." Remaking a Broken World is the title of the book, and I warmly recommend it to you. Do you believe what Christopher Ash has just said to us? Each of the New Testament letters to groups of Christian believers in different places testifies in one way or another to the validity of his estimate. His excellent little book shows how the Bible as a whole points in the same direction from beginning to end. Certainly, the letter that Paul wrote to Timothy concerning the life of the believers in Ephesus provides solid support for his thesis. A little later in that letter that we call 1 Timothy, a little later than the point that we have reached, Paul will describe the fellowship of believers there in Ephesus as the household of God, the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of truth. And indeed, everything that he has written in the letter so far that we have been seeing together clearly arises from his understanding of the inestimable worth and significance of the gathering of believers there in Ephesus. And yet, churches are typically unimpressive, fragile, easily discouraged, often divided, sometimes misled. Certainly there were problems there in Ephesus. These focused on certain persons who were teaching things that deviated from the gospel with which Paul had been entrusted. And Timothy had been charged to stop them doing that. Why? Because of the damage they could do to the life of the gathering of God's people. To the damage they were doing to what Paul describes as the love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. It seems to me clear that it's in the context of the tremendous importance of the local gathering of those whose faith is in Jesus Christ that the words we heard last week make sense. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to oversight, he desires a good work. The oversight, the watching over, the caring for, the protecting, the guarding of God's church is good precisely because God cares for this gathering of his people. He cares more than words can express. And if you care about the health and the well-being of God's church, how good is that? And that's what Paul has highlighted at the beginning of chapter 3 of this letter. We noticed last week that the vocabulary Paul used is a little strange to our ears. Oversight, watching over. And I did suggest that it's not a bad idea when we have strayed from biblical vocabulary. We've often strayed from biblical thinking. Not necessarily, but often. And it's not a bad idea to start thinking again in the terms that the Bible gives us. But this morning, I hope that we will see how his language is even stranger to our ears as he continues and outlines the kind of persons we need to oversee a church. And so let's read on in chapter 3, verse 2. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. It's a well-known passage, and it's one that has often been treated as a kind of checklist of qualifications for Christian leadership. Can you tick all these boxes? Then you're suitable. Any unchecked boxes? Well, that would disqualify you. Well, I think it's rather more than that. These words are certainly very important for anyone who aspires to what Paul calls oversight. They're also important for all of us who acknowledge and welcome the good work of oversight that is exercised towards us. But we should take these words more seriously than a list to be ticked or crossed. Three things convince me that that's an inadequate use of these words. First, the list doesn't appear to be comprehensive. For any particular responsibilities in any actual church, it is very likely that there would be qualifications needed that are not mentioned here. Second, at various points, as we will see in a moment, the list is quite imprecise for the purpose of a tick-a-box approach. And third, a number of the qualities mentioned are very hard to measure in a checklist kind of way. How sober-minded, how self-controlled, how respectable. You apply this as a checklist, and whether you pass or fail depends a lot on the rigour. It wouldn't be hard to fail everyone if you use the passage like that. Now, rather, what we have here, in my judgment, is a searching and profound presentation of what matters for the good work of oversight. Here is a vision of what matters if you aspire to oversight. Here is a portrait of what we should expect in those who watch over us because of the work. Because of the work, because of the task, these are the qualities that are needed. You see, therefore, at the beginning of verse 2, makes that clear. You may have noticed on other occasions, I'm always interested in the word therefore. It is almost always repays careful thought. Why is it that the goodness of the work of oversight in the Christian fellowship means that the overseer must be as described here? Now, it seems to me that the list of what is needed in an overseer presents a picture of a person who is, let me put it like this, firmly in the grip of the gospel of God's glorious grace. You see, the teachers who needed to be silenced in Ephesus had swerved from this gospel and the genuine faith that it ignites and the clean conscience it gives and the purified heart that it provides and the love that results. Those who oversee God's church must be people who are truly shaped by the mercy of the one who came into the world to save sinners. Now let me make two general observations about the qualities as they're described here before we look at them in a little more detail. The first rather striking point is that almost nothing is said here about what precisely will be involved in the work of oversight. Famously, the New Testament is remarkably unprescriptive in the specific details about how the care and nurture of churches is to be done. What Paul makes very clear is the goal. In the words of chapter 1, verse 5, it is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. But he doesn't prescribe structures or programs. A second obvious but important feature of the passage before us is that when Paul describes what we need in those who do the work of oversight in a church, he doesn't mention a whole lot of things that we might have expected. Particularly in our day, when we've all been touched by the culture of celebrity, more than most of us care to admit, when we've all imbibed ideas about leadership, generally from the business world of capitalism, where success is visible and measurable and usually financial, and when, frankly, we can see that many churches are in decline. Few are actually growing, and we long for new and bold ideas and energetic drive to change things. It really is, I think, a shock to hear and take seriously the terms in which Paul spells out what is needed in those who would oversee God's people. Now, don't mishear me. Does the fact that Paul does not mention what we might call personality traits mean that your God-given personality will play no part in the effectiveness of your caring for God's people? Of course not. Does his near silence with respect to such things as vision setting and organisational skills and what we generally mean by leadership abilities mean that such things are useless? Again, no. If he says almost nothing about skills, does that mean that an overseer needs no skills? No. But what does bother me is when our concern is entirely with such things and we just take the apostles' concerns for granted. He does it the other way round. He takes lots of things for granted, but draws our attention to what we might describe as matters of Christian character. Let's look at the portrait he paints. I'm seeing it with 11 parts. Okay, this is an 11-point sermon, a little different. 1. The picture begins and ends with public reputation. Verse 2. An overseer must be above reproach. And he picks up the same idea in verse 7. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders. It sort of frames what is said. Christians are not a secret society. The gospel is public. It addresses the whole world. I love the way Paul testified on one occasion to King Festus about his proclamation of Christ. "This has not been done in a corner," he said. And so the gathering of believers is not something that happens, so to speak, behind closed doors. And an overseer must be a person of good repute in the public eye. It doesn't mean they must be popular, or even that they must be liked. But in the circles in which they are known, and to the extent that they are known by outsiders to the Christian faith, there must be no scandal, no hypocrisy, no valid ground for such. What a terrible thing it has been when the reputation of the church has been protected by keeping secrets about its leaders. It's appalling. What is called for is openness and overseers whose lives stand up to public scrutiny. Now, the matters that follow may well provide details with the kind of reputation that an overseer must have. He must be, says Paul, second point, the husband of one wife. It's a phrase that has been the subject of a huge amount of discussion. I think there are about 10 possibilities that you find in the commentaries. Just what did Paul mean by this phrase? Very imprecise, really. Did he mean that an overseer must be married? Was he writing this to exclude polygamists? Was he insisting that such a person must not be somebody who has remarried after his wife has died or there has been a divorce? Now, while the phrase is ambiguous, I don't think it means any of those things in this context. The actual phrase in Greek is simply, he must be a man of one woman. A one-woman man. Assuming rather than requiring that he is married, he must be faithful to his wife. There is no sense, you see, here that we so often hear in the political scandals of our day that a person's private life has nothing to do with their public responsibilities. What sort of nonsense is that? If a man is a liar and a cheat towards his wife, why should we think that he can be trusted in public life? Well, how much more is that true in the one who would care for God's people? What does a man know of God's faithfulness if he himself is unfaithful? And so, with so many here who do aspire to some form of oversight, as it is the subject of Paul's words here, I draw your attention to the fact that faithfulness in your marriage is essential if you are to be trusted with this good work. See to it that in your marriage you are held by the faithfulness of God. The next three terms Paul uses I take together: sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable. Perhaps we could sum this up as self-discipline. Sober-minded, it's actually the word for literally being sober, not drunk, but it also, like the English word, means sensible. It suggests taking serious things seriously. We don't need overseers who cannot be serious. Self-controlled has the sense of control over one's behaviour and the impulses and emotions behind it. We don't need overseers who lose control. Respectable tells us that we don't need overseers who can't be respected. Just notice that these are not ostentatious qualities. They're not showy. They don't draw attention to themselves. That is why we need to have them drawn to our attention. they matter. The grace of God in Jesus Christ casts a wonderful but serious light on life. And an overseer must be a person who knows that. The fourth part of the picture is hospitable. Literally, one who has a love for strangers. This is not our modern concept of hospitality, which too often is a form of showing off, putting on an impressive dinner party or something, or meal with lots and lots of guests so they'll all see how good you are. We need overseers who will not treat the church as a closed clique, because it's not. It goes without saying, of course, that the overseer must love those who are in the fellowship, but he must also love the stranger, the visitor, the newcomer. The gospel of the one who came into the world to save sinners has only been grasped by a person who therefore cares for strangers. The fifth element in this developing picture is often understood as the only reference to skills or abilities in this passage. In the middle of the description of godly character comes this rather surprising little phrase, or it's just one word in the Greek, able to teach. However, I don't think that Paul is referring here to communication skills. Yes, I think that communication skills are important. I just don't think that Paul mentions them. For what makes a person able to teach for Paul? Well, it's that he himself has a firm grasp of the truth. In another place where Paul outlines what an overseer must be, he says he must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught. Hear that? He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction. You see, what makes someone able to teach? Holding firm to the trustworthy word. That's the priority. It's actually been suggested that the word, by me from time to time, that the word translated able to teach really means teachable. Now, that actually does fit the two contexts in which this word occurs in the New Testament, but my consultant in the New Testament department here assures me that it's not right, so I'll abandon it. And since he's listening, I mean, if he wasn't listening, I'd run it, but he's here listening. So. Now, this is not to say that you should not give serious attention to learning how to communicate. Okay, don't mishear me. But it is to say that there is something more important. There is something more important than being a great communicator. It's knowing and understanding and firmly believing what you're talking about. I'm alarmed at some of the discussions of preaching that I hear these days. A disconnect is being created in the minds of some between thorough, careful, deep, extensive learning of God's truth and preaching. As though the very best preparation for a preacher is something other than knowing well and deeply and firmly believing what you're talking about. And I say again, I'm not speaking against learning the skills of communication, but I'm saying that that will not make you a good preacher. That will not make you able to teach, in Paul's terms. Sixth part of the picture is verse 3. Not a drunkard. Alcohol is not evil, but the misuse of alcohol, so pervasive in our society, but present in most societies, damages people. And I believe we ought to reflect carefully on alcohol and its use, particularly as it is such a phenomenon in Australian society today. Have you recognised how alcohol is very often a pathetic substitute and perversion of what should be known by Christian people. That is, to need alcohol to relax, to need alcohol to relate, to need alcohol to escape from stress and anxiety. It can actually work to a degree and in a way, but it's not a substitute for casting your anxieties on the one who cares for you. It's not a substitute for the love for one another inspired by the Holy Spirit. In cultures where alcohol is badly abused, Christians have often gone further than the letter of Scripture's teaching and chosen not to drink alcohol at all, or only in very small amounts and very rarely. Now, that's not Paul's requirement here, but it's very important that you take seriously responsible behaviour with alcohol. The seventh component of the presentation of what we need in an overseer, I'll group together and call temper. Not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome. That's a natural sequel, isn't it, to not a drunkard, because violent and quarrelsome behaviour is so often an effect of too much alcohol. But this part of the picture has its own integrity. The work of overseeing can too easily become a platform for overbearing behaviour. You know, the leadership manuals, they'll tell you about the importance of assertiveness. How can you be a leader if you are not assertive? Paul tells us about the importance of gentleness. It's when your ambition, you see, is about you that frustrations can explode in verbal or even sometimes physical violence. You take disagreements personally. We don't need people like that as overseers. We need people who know deeply the gentleness of Christ. The eighth piece of this picture is not a lover of money. It's astonishing how quickly Christian fellowships became the objects of exploitation by some. It's just about as astonishing how many who at one time turned their back on financial prospects in order to do the good work of serving Christ and his people later care rather too much about money. You cannot love God and money, said Jesus. We need overseers who love God. The ninth portion, there's only 11, the ninth portion of the presentation is given at greater length in verses 4 and 5. He must manage his own household well and with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. That's the ESV. I'm not entirely happy with it, or any of the other translations for that matter. They overdo it. Manage is not the right word, I'm sure. It translates a word that over literally is stand before. It carries a sense of leadership, but not a sense of management. Certainly not in the sense in which we use the word, which is sort of comes out of the business world these days. Also, keeping his children submissive is too severe. It says having his children in submission. In other words, a man's care for his family must be such that he can be expected to care for God's people. Don't think that you will be better at caring for God's people than you are at caring for your family. You will not be more Christian in church than you are in your family. Not really. Which is exactly what Paul says in verse 5. For if someone does not know how to manage, lead his own household, how will he care for God's church? There is really just one more in verse 6. He must not be a recent convert. The word is newly planted. It's a rather lovely image of the new Christian, isn't it? Newly planted in Christ, a seedling. The good work of oversight of God's people involves such a turning upside down of the world's values and ways that it requires maturity in Christ. So easily, if you lack that maturity, it becomes about you. And so the danger for a newly planted believer is, you see it there, that he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. In other words, humility. It's not about you, is essential in an overseer. Conceit is terribly, terribly dangerous. And then finally, Paul returns to where he began, reputation. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. How the evil one loves to bring the gospel into disrepute. And how often he uses the same old tricks. Trip up those who have some responsibility for God's church, bring them into disgrace, and so make their gospel a laughingstock, or worse. Now, brothers and sisters, it might be a little difficult to hold all these things together, to put this picture together, but it seems to me that this has been a sobering word. And a sobering word particularly for people like us. I want to say two things in conclusion. First, don't allow a passage like this to be taken out of its gospel context. The commentators will tell you that many of the terms in this list are found in non-Christian ethical lists in the Greco-Roman world. I believe that is almost irrelevant. Here is the picture of a person shaped and formed by the grace of God that has appeared in Jesus Christ. Some express surprise that the picture is so ordinary. And in a sense it is. This is not the stuff of celebrity, it's the stuff of godliness. It's not a person who's going to change the world. It's a person who's come to love and trust the one who has changed the world. It's not a picture of impossible giftedness. It's a picture of the ordinary, if we can call it ordinary, the ordinary effects of knowing God's grace. Second, can I encourage you to take the opportunity of hearing these words of God today for some honest and true self-examination? Not every Christian person should aspire to be an overseer. Good work that it is. But God's people need overseers like this, because God's church is the most important thing happening in the world.